So Quintessence has worked in the IT community for over 10 years. She is currently a developer advocate at Logs.io, which is an Elk as a service provider. Outside of work, she is one of the leaders and co-founders of Inclusive Tech Buffalo, which helps underrepresented groups start careers in technology through workshops and mentorships. So we're very excited to have Quintessence coming to speak to us today, and here she is.
Good morning, everyone. Did you enjoy the break just now? Get your coffee and snacks and all the good stuff to tide you over to lunch, right? Lunch is only another, hour out, so we should all be good there. And to get right started, since he mentioned it, I think it's a great idea, since I'm going to be talking about diversity, if you guys do take him up on his offer, and if you meet people that you haven't met before or wouldn't have an occasion to speak with generally, because that's one of the ways that we bring underrepresented groups into professional networking and get them started with their careers in tech. And the other way that we get them started is by focusing on why we hire people. And this isn't necessarily the immediately obvious. So when we have, a hiring opportunity, we usually have a list of goals or the value that we want someone to bring into our company, right? We want someone who knows AWS, or we need someone who understands Python, and so we write a job rec based on these things. But then our applicants will self-select their resumes based on how well they feel they match our job requisition, and they'll go through the technical interviews. And as much as that helps filter out candidates, what are we actually selecting on? Are we selecting purely on technical acumen, or are we also selecting on these other features? This person works well in a team. This person has experience running conferences, and isn't that great because we have internal initiatives to have company-run events, right? So when we're making these other selective processes, we're actually hiring on more than just, AWS, Python, and et cetera. We're actually hiring on everything that this person brings to the table and what gaps we feel we need to fill within our organizations. And this goes into how we currently perceive diversity, because right now, diversity is kind of newish in the way that we're trying to do it with intention. We're trying to intentionally diversify our workforce and various environments within our culture. And prior, we maybe didn't do this quite so well, right? So as we're trying to change our perspectives on diversity, we're trying to change our perspectives of how we speak to each other and how we interact in a variety of environments, including the workplace. But the reason I focus on serendipity is specifically the stuff that we have a hard time filling out for. And so the story I really like for this is a few years ago, someone that was at the time a technologist for Medium wrote a blog post based on a bug report that Medium received. And the bug report was as follows: hey, I noticed I can't write a Polish diacritic S in my blog post. It just doesn't display. And immediately, the Medium developers are looking for, some sort of language processing. They say, we don't do language processing. We don't understand why you would have a problem typing this character, but sure enough, we can replicate it. But as it so happens, this one Polish individual was on the team at the time, and he says, I know why this is, because I grew up in Poland, and I know that the way that we type this character, spoiler for the end of his very lovely post, is we do Command or Control S. And what we do protect in Medium is for people, saving the HTML file to their desktop or what have you. And that feature is what is preventing this character from being written. So instead of a bunch of engineers kind of crawling through the code base, someone was actually able to bring their lived experience to the table and say, I know what this is. And that is the power of diversity, right? They didn't hire this individual for being Polish per se. They hired him because of his experience with code and typography, as it happens for him specifically. But because of that experience and because of where he grew up, he was able to solve a problem in a matter of seconds based on a 30-year lifespan, right? That other people would have had to kind of get to a little more circuitously by looking through code bases and running tests and such things. And so when we're talking about intentional diversity and bringing in people and making space for them in our working environments, this is the type of thing that we're talking about bringing in. It's not just the stuff like AWS Lambda or do you work in a team. It's all the things that we don't know how to check for, the problems we won't know we're going to have to solve that you will know just by your different perspective. The current state of diversity is fragile, right? Because these diversity efforts, as I already mentioned, are very new. And so in order for them to really continue to take off and kind of integrate, we need to support them. They're not self-sustaining yet. And that means that all of us in our companies really need to be able to take this on and say, okay, we're going to make an effort to make space for other people. We're going to make, an effort for anyone over the age of 25. Because if you look at the median age of a software developer, he is a white male 25. So anyone who's not white male 25 is starting to get in increasingly overlapping underrepresented groups. And we need to make space for everyone. We need to make space to attenuate talent. The other aspect of diversity is that it's complex. And when you're talking about the complexity of diversity, it's not as simple as, okay, well, I'm not going to discriminate against anyone ever, because that's all well-meaning, but it's not necessarily easy to catch yourself with all the little things you've been socialized to do that maybe you weren't socialized to do in a malicious way. It's just happening in the background of your brain like a background tab, and it's just running back there. And so an example of this is if you're entering a workplace and you're talking to your prospective manager in an interview type situation, and just like they're interviewing you, you're interviewing them. Do we align? Do I feel as your potential employee that we align? When I ask you questions, how do you respond to me? Are you helpful? Can I check you and see if we're in the same moral compass? But the questions you think to ask are based on your own lived experience and not the lived experience of others. And an environment that is toxic for someone else might not be toxic for you. And you might not be able to easily gauge if a workplace environment that is therefore safe for you is unsafe for someone else. And that is part of all the emotional labor that goes into helping each other and fostering development for everyone. So that's a big lead up. What can we do, right? Because it seems like it's a very vast space for a lot of things to be going on and a lot of potential for miscommunication, but also a lot of room for beauty and growth. So it's important to recognize that life is a series of experiences, right? So when you're treating people and when people come up to you, you kind of start to perceive them a certain way, even if you're not actively aware of that fact, right? So let's say, for case of example, you are a manager and you have this employee and she never comes to you with problems and you don't understand why, and it's very frustrating for you. So in your head, you're perceiving her as a problem that you need to fix in this scenario. You're like, I really need you to talk to me and I don't understand why you don't. Meanwhile, for her, her lived experience is as an underrepresented group in tech. I've already identified her as a woman with my pronoun choice, but she might be, a person of color or a person of a different ethnicity besides, or anything, really, right? So she has this lived experience. It's entirely possible that in her working history, she has had managers who are just dismissive of her just by her existing in their space. And so she has learned to be quiet. And by treating her like a problem, even though he wants to fix this, he's actually perpetuating the problem. And that's what we mean by life is a series of experiences. He has a series of experience, she has a series of experience, and then they come into conflict. And this is all leading up to the fact that mindset matters. And because this is really important, with emphasis, your mindset matters. If you treat someone like a problem, even if you're trying to fix it, the emotions and the nonverbal communication that you're giving off is that they are a problem, and they will receive that. They might not be able to articulate it, but they will receive it. And so when you're treating them like a problem, they'll treat you like an aggressor. And that doesn't really move us forward in a productive fashion. And one more story before I kick off into action item slides, right? There's this book that I recommend called The Anatomy of Peace, where you have this story that's being told from the perspective of the first person narrator. And he's going through a series of kind of life experiences that lead him to conflict resolution techniques that he also outlines in the book. And in this book, he's talking about how his wife, Hannah, once asked him to mow the lawn. And he said he'd mow the lawn. And she said, great. And he goes out because he has stuff to do. And he runs through the lawn. And she's like, you didn't even edge it. And he's like, but I mowed it, but you didn't edge it. Conflict. Fine, I'll do it later. He leaves, but she's still mad. And then they have this conflict, right? But they didn't communicate a whole bunch of things. They didn't communicate what lawn mowing meant for them and what she expected and what he expected. And because they both saw each other as a problem, they didn't actually resolve anything. And even though he did the action, they were still acting towards each other as kind of mutual antagonists. So in order to fix some of this, let's shift our mindset. This is one that I touch on a lot. which is Coach Don't Rescue, and it comes up in a lot of mentorship environments. So how many people here have ever been mentored? Ever, in anything, ever? Okay. I was gonna say there are not enough hands. Some of you have been mentored in something. So the idea between Coach Don't Rescue, it comes from something I noticed when I was a junior engineer. And when I would ask questions of my mentor, he would be like, here, let me show you, and you show me if you can replicate, and I would proceed. But I started to notice that like when the male junior employees would ask for assistance, it was look this up and show me what you find or show me what you come up with. And as a one-off, this is pretty harmless, right? It's just answering a question in two different styles. But when it's systemic, you start to notice that different groups start to go through life with different mindsets of their own, right? Proactive versus reactive engineer in this case. If someone's been taught to replicate someone else's work, or not truly just replicate, but just kind of base off of somebody else like that or rely on somebody else versus kind of fostering and innovating on their own, you get two different styles of code, two different styles of solving problems that just diverge more and more over time. Another big one is the difference between giving someone a hand up versus what's called a handout. And the handout mentality is kind of the nobody ever helped me to where I am kind of thinking, right? But it's not just about that. So early on in my career when I was hired, this was articulated very well by one of my first mentors, I guess, in the space when he said, I want it to be clear that I'm hiring you on your potential because a lot of people will hire men based on their potential, but women based on their existing skill set. So the whole mentality shift here is what you are versus what you may be. And figuring out who someone may be is relatively difficult, but every junior employee or every new person to the space requires mentors, managers, and everyone who is interested in fostering their career development to pay very close attention to this because you're aware of the problem space. You know what questions they don't know to ask yet. You can proactively help them. But you proactively help them by empowering them to do for themselves rather than doing for them. Along this method, you have diverse learning styles as well, and that goes into mentorship. It also goes into just dialogue between individuals, right? So how many people have been told to reference or read the manual in response to a question? Ever? Yeah, good about half, which is not as many as I was expecting. I was actually expecting more than that. But when you're told to read the manual, it hurts on two fronts. First of all, if you're not being cautious of who you're speaking with, that person might not be a native speaker of the language the manual is written in. So there might be a complexity barrier for them when they're trying to read through it. The manual might not be written for their learning level. And by that I mean, let's say that they're new to the space, as people can be. And the manual is written from the perspective of someone who's been in the industry for years. And so they don't think to clearly articulate things they think are just common knowledge at this point, when it's only common knowledge because they have 15 or 20 years experience and it's just ingrained in them now. So the manual isn't clear enough for the newbie to actually get much out of it, right? So good documentation, by the way, A+, right? Who here appreciates good documentation? There we go, you are still awake, excellent. So when we're supporting these different learning styles, we need to be conscientious of the asker and what people are asking us for, but also when someone's coming to us for assistance, when we're providing that assistance, we want to make sure that we're doing so in a way that they can actually consume and learn and grow with, right? Another thing that I like to point out is this idea of reciprocal mentorship, and this is something that we do with Inclusive Tech Buffalo in particular. So one of the organizers that we brought on, she was actually very junior to the entire industry, right? So she was a college student graduating, rising senior, and she was looking to professionally network and learn more skills and all these things. So when we saw her, we saw this person who could really benefit from the exact services we so happened to provide. But also we saw what we needed, which as a volunteer-based organization, what we needed was kind of a task manager or an engineering parlance, a scrum master, right? We needed someone to help steer the ship so that we weren't all running in our little pockets. And as it so happens, this girl puts organization to shame. She is amazing. She could have been military, but she wasn't. And it was just very precise and super helpful. So when we brought her on, the gap she filled for us was all about this high-level organization stuff, but the gap we filled for her was all the professional networking. And so it was mutually beneficial, and it's important to consciously recognize that that these mentees that come to you, these new hires, they aren't coming from you from a space of nothing. They might not know about code, but they are bringing other things of value to your industry from the first day they walk through that door. And if you don't treat them like they do, they're gonna start to struggle because they won't feel valuable. You'll see the beginnings of what is later called imposter syndrome, where they feel like they don't know anything, and a bunch of other concepts related and adjacent to that you can see start to pop up, especially in underrepresented groups, because they have an extra impetus to prove themselves. One major thing beyond the mentorship is how you provide challenges to groups as well. So one of the piece of advice that I got early on is, if you want to learn something, find a problem and solve it. And I mean, this is handy, but there's a cap, right? You are limited by your own knowledge set. So when you're trying to proceed and solve problems, you seek the problems that you already kind of know about so you can at least mentally model a solution, but you're also limited to what you already know in the space. Like, let's say you want to just write a chatbot to learn how to write Python, and you write it up, and you write it in a very kind of linear way, right? And someone else looks at it and they're like, oh, why didn't you use this library, or why didn't you do it this way? And the simple answer is because you didn't know yet. You didn't know that was an option. So when you're providing challenges, it's important as a mentor, as a manager, or a leader, that you provide challenges that actually touch on the expertise that you've noticed they don't have yet, to foster them to get that experience that you know they'll need later. Resilience goes into this as well. So when you're talking about proactive versus passive, right, you have people who want to be part of the solution pretty actively, and these are the people who are, to the previous slide, providing the challenges and trying to help people learn new things, but then you also have people who are doing it on pay grades, right? You'll hear of companies that go through initiatives to try and balance the pay gap across gender, across race, and various demographics, right? But passive acceptance is just kind of that idea where it's like, but it's just like that. And it is just like that, but it doesn't have to be. And this is where the emotional labor comes in. For example, not just the pay gaps, but when I was talking to someone else in the industry, she was talking about one of the biggest things that helped her career was early on when she started writing as a teenager, her editor didn't say and remind her all the time that she was a teenage girl. He just edited her piece. And he treated it like any other body of work that he received. And as he edited her pieces and noticed that she could write quickly and proficiently and do more, he sent her on more advanced and more complicated projects. And he didn't seem to be kind of silencing her off or treating her differently from her male counterparts because of her gender. And this allowed her to really flourish in her career. And these kinds of things where these managers and mentors are, again, fostering development are really helpful to help ensure that the overall community is more accepting of other people. This pyramid, in terms of confidence, you'll notice I put confidence at the top. And the reason that I put confidence at the top is because it's supported by both knowledge and experience. And some of the advice that people get to kind of band-aid the problems I outlined on the previous slide is, well, fake it till you make it. Who's heard fake it till you make it? Some of you are asleep. Yeah, you know you're asleep, okay. So when you're told to fake it till you make it, it doesn't kind of foster any deep sense of confidence. You're just kind of projecting it out. But if you bolster someone's knowledge and experience, that supports confidence like two pillars. And it's interesting when you watch the ways that people have been socialized to interact with each other, where the sources of the problem of lack of confidence are treated differently. So as a woman, I can speak as a woman. Usually when I had confidence issues early in my career, it was treated as like, oh, it's just a thing for you to overcome. You clearly have knowledge. So fake it till you make it. But if a male is having a confidence issue, he's kind of, again, this is all subtle and background processes, assumed, oh, well, let's teach you things. Maybe you're missing something, because it's expected that women have confidence issues and expected that men don't. And so people aren't fact-checking their assumptions as to why these two different groups of people might be having the same issue. When in fact, fake it till you make doesn't really help anybody. And if you help someone embolden their confidence by giving them knowledge and experience, then you will find that everything just kind of flows together. Explicit onboarding, in terms of helping fostering confidence early, I find is very helpful. So how many of you, when you recently onboarded at a company, were onboarded by the most senior person? Cool. How many were onboarded by the last onboarded person? Second most junior to you? A little less than a quarter. Okay. How many of you had no explicit onboarding whatsoever? Woof. unfortunately a little bit of what you expect, right? But when you're talking about explicit onboarding, it's very important because when we're talking about implicit onboarding, you're relying on the existing social structure of your company to function. And it might be functioning as it was, but if you're intentionally trying to diversify, if you're intentionally trying to change it, and you're perpetuating the same thing, you're trying to get change without change. And just saying like that probably makes it obvious why this doesn't actually work out so well. And to drag it out a little bit further and maybe more clearly, if the median age of the developer is 25 and you're bringing on someone who's a parent, but the younger 20-somethings are used to going through topics maybe after work or they go out to a bar, but the new parent has to pick up his or her kid from practice, soccer, football, whatever, and they have other family commitments to maintain, then they're not going to be going with you to the bar necessarily. And if you don't have an explicit process that says, I'm going to teach you what we expect you to know here, then they're going to miss the gap and they will underperform at your company unless they themselves put in extra emotional labor and extra just labor, I guess, in general, because they're going to have to research the things that you aren't communicating to them. And while they can do that, that's extra work for them, and that's not necessarily a valuable use of everyone's time, right? I've also found that in terms of explicit onboarding, it is best, and there is research supporting this, to have the next most junior person, the person who went through the process last, do the next onboarding. And the reason for this is they know where all the gaps are and they can start to fill them. And let's say you have everything documented in Confluence to keep it easy, right? So in the current onboarding process, the last person who passed and the current person going through can make any changes to the documentation and treat onboarding as it is. It's a living document, it's living change. As your product changes, as your needs change, you need these new hires to grow with that change. So how many people have had wars with job titles in the sense of pay grades? Quarter? Okay. Have you ever been told that job titles don't matter? Some of you are raising hands and some of you are laughing. I can't read that from up here, not gonna lie. So you have, I'm going to assume from the volume of laughter that at least half of you have heard that job titles don't matter, probably from an employer. So job titles totally do matter. Has anyone ever heard the joke that the DevOps tax, add DevOps to a title, it gets more pay? You didn't hear about it, but you have now. So the idea is if you're working in an industry and you know the hierarchy of job titles in that industry and you take on a mentee, whether through your direct work or through a volunteer effort or whatever suits you, you're going to find out that job titles matter. And if someone is looking, let's say someone's looking to work in infrastructure, right? And you know the job titles for that space, DevOps engineer, infrastructure engineer, cloud automation, et cetera. And you happen to notice that the industry favors SRE and DevOps engineer. What are you going to tell your mentee to look for in terms of what titles will give them the best return on their knowledge set, right? How are you going to empower them to help themselves? And it's very important to recognize that job titles do matter and to pass on that information to anyone who's looking to you for professional expertise, right? And when you're looking around for professional expertise, it's not just about the job titles, right? So you can look for SREs and DevOps engineers, which is my background, but also full stack engineer and those other related professions, right? You know who's hiring in your area, and you know who knows who's hiring in that area. And I kind of mentally nickname this the hiring nucleus, the who's who network local to you. And when you're taking on these new mentees, again, either professionally or through a volunteer org, you don't want to do for them. You don't want to be that person that's like, oh yeah, I got them that job. Because you want them to empower themselves and you want to say, okay, this is my extended professional network. I want you to come with me to all the meetups that I go to and meet all the people that I know, and then you're gonna talk to them and they're gonna talk to you and you're gonna get your own job and you can say, I got that job because I know things. And that will already, going back to the pillars in the pyramid a few slides ago, will help bolster confidence because instead of feeling like they rely on others to get them their jobs, they can see that their own existing knowledge and expertise got them that job just fine. They just needed to know who to meet. And that's where you come in. Slowly starting to wrap up here, but one of the big things that made a huge difference in Buffalo in particular was the coffee meetups. And I know that these have caught on kind of nationally and maybe internationally at this point. Lean coffee, open coffee, who's heard of these or anything varying of them? A third. Okay, so the idea with these coffee meetups are usually either morning or evening meetups. In Buffalo now we have both to try and catch the AM and the PM crowd. But the idea is that you have these structured professional networking events to allow people to organically meet in a way that they would not otherwise. And so this is important. So one of the ways that I get to meet all of you is because this event is structured in such a way that I and other speakers and other attendees, we can all organically discuss with each other. And there's nothing forcing that to happen where you're like icebreaker activity. You know, HR does their best and we love them, but it's rough. It's a little rough. So when we have these organic activities, it's actually easier people start talking about themselves from a calmer place and maybe a more authentic place. And making sure, again, that underrepresented groups know and have access to these places allows them to network, allows them to know who's who, and allows them to present themselves and get hired and join the community and partake and bring everything that they bring with them. For anyone who likes to take pictures of slides, this is the slide. Because this first article is the one with the Medium post that I mentioned earlier, and he actually goes through a history of keyboarding in Poland for like 4 decades. Because as I mentioned, he is a typographer, he also writes brilliantly. So I definitely recommend, even if you don't do the rest, which I also recommend, you should definitely read his. But one last note, slides available, before I go, is something that's important to recognize with diversity efforts is right now, we the speakers have your attention on this stage, right? We are seen as subject matter experts, and so we're speaking to you. And some of us are from underrepresented groups, one or more, right? There's some overlap there. And while we have your attention, and while that's super helpful and we appreciate that attention, it's important that we also maintain your attention on the ground, in offices, in meetings, in meetups, in the broader community. Because if we have your attention here, where your focus is on us by design, but you're not focused on other members of your community when you're actually existing in the community, then it actually hinders and halts diversification within that community, right? So I just ask that when you're thinking about this as you go through the day-to-day, tomorrow, after you leave, that you remember that diversity didn't just happen in this 30 minutes, that it's actually ongoing for the rest of time, right? Until we start to more equalize the community. With that, thank you.